Hello and welcome to the latest edition of The Shindig, brought to you by the Red River Archaeology Group. I'm your host, Dr. Tom Horne, and I'm joined as ever by producer extraordinaire and my co-host,
Luke Barry. That's me. Tom, I forgot how sensual and serious you get as soon as we start recording.
I was just saying we're a bit out of practice, but I can't be any more enthused by the podcast that we've got coming up today, because it is with Jane Kershaw and Rory Naismith. Now, the paper that they are talking about is open access, so it's free. It's in Antiquity, and the title is Byzantine Plate and Frankish Mines, the Provenance of Silver in Northwest European Coinage during the long 8th century. And that's roughly from 660 to 820. And the authors are Jane Kershaw, Stephen Merkel, Paolo and Rory Naismith. And Jane and Rory joined us today to talk about the fascinating world of silver. Everybody loves silver. You love silver, don't you?
Love silver. Can't get enough of it. If anyone wants to send me some silver, I'll gladly accept.
Yeah, silver, gold, or just some really nice copper alloy, maybe some gilding on it. Yeah. We will accept any of them. Now, we had a great discussion you're about to listen to. If you're interested in trade, if you're interested in the big figures like Charlemagne and Offa, if you're interested in coins and money and shiny things, if you're also interested in hard science, laser ablation, chemical analysis of silver to characterize it, find out where it comes from. And this paper discovers a really, really important split chronologically in where the silver is coming from, with major, major ramifications for what is happening in Europe in the long 8th century. So we hope you enjoy. So Jane and Rory, thank you so much for joining us today. The title of your paper, I suppose that's the first question. You talk about the long 8th century, and some people might have heard about the long 18th century, and you'll be playing on that. But what is the long 8th century in northwestern Europe?
Do you want to take that, Jane, or shall I?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, by long 8th century, we're trying to get at this period that runs from roughly the late 7th century, around about 670 or so, through to the early years of the 9th century. And this is the first 150 years or so of the silver penny. That's what we're defining this around. It's when these little silver coins appear towards the end of the 7th century. They evolve gradually over this period, so that by the latter half of it, they are broader and thinner, and they've got the names of kings on them. But the general feature of interest is that there are quite a lot of them across that whole period. This is a real surge of monetization when you can see that lots and lots of coins being made in lots and lots of places across Northwest Europe.
Yeah, and it's a term that's frequently used by historians, I think, in particular, isn't it? And I think if we were to start in 700, we'd just be too late, because we really see the beginnings of coinage and also of like the development of trading sites along the coast. It's all happening in the later decades of the 7th century. So we wanted to include a term that really brought in that change, and it also continues after 800. So we needed to be flexible in our chronological approach.
I love it. I'm definitely going to use it in conversation. That tells you the kind of company that I keep, perhaps. But I love it. So that's sort of a chronology. We're talking about roughly about 660 to sort of about 820. That's kind of what we're kind of meaning by the long 8th century. So again, if people are, we like with the Shindig, we're not assuming people have any much prior knowledge about it. So who are the sort of powers, what are the sort of polities and countries, if that's the right term at that time, and how do they view money? How is trade? How are people buying and selling things? So maybe just starting with a sort of very rough political sketch, and then the sort of forms of money that if you're in sort of 650 going to 660 in northwestern Europe, what kind of forms of money are you used to?
Well, in the superpower of Northwest Europe at this stage is the Merovingian kingdom, which is basically France plus big chunks of what's now Switzerland, Western Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium. And you also have northeast of that, Frisia, which is an area which is at the stage independent, which is very involved in the growing economy of the North Sea. And then on the other side of the North Sea, you have the kingdoms in England, the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which are a lot smaller than England is now. You have probably about 20 or so significant units at this stage, some of which are bigger or more powerful than others. The major ones are Northumbria, Mercia in the Midlands, Kent in the southeast, East Anglia on the east coast, and Wessex in the southwest. And these units have been developed in England, at least, have been developing for a long while by this stage. And they've also been interacting with the Franks for a long time, such that if we want to think about this in terms of coins as one function of trade, the English start making gold ones at the beginning of the 7th century that are modelled on the gold tremises that the Franks have been making. And these are in turn based on the lowest usual gold denomination that had been current in the Roman world and in the early Byzantine period. So that's the basis everyone is working from. And then at some remove, they're modelling their coins on that. What you can see as you move through the 7th century is that in both England and Francia, albeit at slightly different paces, these gold coins are becoming less and less golden. They contain less gold, they contain more other metals, usually silver, and you can see that they are in some ways already moving in the direction of this silver currency that you see exploding towards the end of the 7th century. But if you were to be on a ferry in or whatever you might want to call it in the mid 7th century, the coins you might be carrying would be gold tremises, as they're called in Latin, shillingas in Old English, which would contain probably about 20 or 30% gold and 70-odd% other metals.
Do we know why there was this transition from gold to silver, or was it just cheaper, easier to find? Is that the...
It's a good question. Going right back to the 1930s, there was a historian called Henri Pirenne, whose work was highly influential, and he put a lot of emphasis on this move away from gold in the 7th century. Saw this as down to the Muslim conquests in the early 7th century, essentially cutting off trade in the Mediterranean. And some elements of that are probably right. There's been huge debate on it ever since. Certainly you can see there is less gold coming into Western Europe as you move into the middle decades of the 7th century. So that is one factor. On the other hand, there are some places in Italy and in Spain which just carry on making these debased coins for a long time beyond when the English, the Franks, the Frisians switch over to making silver. So it's not just a facet of there isn't as much gold anymore. It's a conscious decision that we are going to do something different. We are going to use silver.
And Rory, what would you say? Because gold and silver coinage, the value is very different. So it's a whole different, it's a conceptual shift to using lower denominational currency. I always think of the silver coins as being roughly about 15 or 20 pounds in kind of modern day value. I don't know where you'd put gold coinage.
Well, gold it's a lot more than that. Gold by weight was usually thought of as between 10 and 14 times as much as silver in this period. So it's an awful lot more. As you say, it's the difference between, say, a £20 note and if it existed, a £200 note. And there's a lot less you can do with a £200 note. So, yes, the new coinage is not quite go out and buy a single loaf of bread money, but it's certainly an awful lot more versatile than what had been there before.
So although there was currency before, it wasn't really currency on the same scale or utility.
Yeah, that's right.
Had when the silver currency comes in the 670s.
So is that kind of to be used everyday use kind of a situation, or is it?
I'd say, the slight challenge is that there is almost zero written reference to this material. There is quite a bit of textual evidence from England at this stage. You've got Bede's ecclesiastical history, all sorts of other saints' lives and scholarly texts, but these say pretty much nothing about either gold or silver currency. So it really is down to what we can learn from the coins themselves. What you can say is that the distribution of these new silver coins that appear in the late 7th century is It's extremely thick. There's approximately 7,000 of them that have been recorded as finds, and probably a lot more than that have been found but not recorded. They cluster in England. They're very much a phenomenon of the eastern half of the country, which is also where you can see concentration of evidence for settlement and complex distribution of pottery. So essentially, where people are doing economically active things, you find these coins. The other thing that you can say is that they are found not just in towns or just at elite sites. They also occur out in the countryside in places that are just fields now and probably were just fields in the 7th and 8th centuries, which suggests that they are being used very widely by people across society. They're being used by farmers, they're being used by peasants, they're being used by the whole gamut of people. The final thing that you can say is they're very mixed. You do have coins which cluster in particular regions, but you also see there's a lot of bleeding between those regions. There's a lot of just mingling of types from all sorts of different places, including an awful lot from Frisia in England. About 20% of all the coins of this period that you find in England come from the Netherlands. So there's clearly a lot of back and forth between those two. And it's being broken up in a very granular way. People are using these on probably quite a small scale. They're being churned in circulation on a very, very intense local level.
Are they being, I mean, from this stage, we'll go on to the sort of reasons for the changes happening in the 660s and 670s, but do you get half pennies and quarter pennies at this early stage as well in the 7th century?
Not really, which is interesting. You do have a few Merovingian, Frankish halfpennies, obols, they're known as in the Frankish context, but you don't see those in England. There's a few, as in maybe half a dozen examples of cut early pennies, but not enough to suggest that this was a significant phenomenon. It looks like people generally used them as pennies. There also aren't very many hoards, which is interesting. There are some, but not nearly as many as one would expect, given the volume of single finds, which is interesting. It says something again about how these are being used, that they're all about quite dispersed circulation and not about accumulating wealth in the same way as coins do in some other periods.
And yeah, so that's just interesting, just the way that, you know, I suppose there's still a novelty almost at that stage, and you're not cutting up, and that's a conceptual thing that we think is quite an easy thing, that you think you just cut it up in half, but that's a sort of later thing when people are more used to these sort of coinages. So I suppose the next question is, you've alluded to maybe some trade between Frisia and sort of contacts across the North Sea. So then what, you know, if we're standing there and say 670, what is the changes that are happening in the decade ahead of us, you know, compared to the decade behind us? What is trade? Is that beginning to build? I think your article, you talk about the effect of, you know, the growth of, you know, these productive sites, these sort of early trading sites, and potentially sort of acts of God, like, you know, sort of plagues and famines. So what is happening then for this initial change in the sort of 670s that we're getting this coinage, that there's a need for it essentially?
Yes, coinage is not the only dramatic change that we see at this time. It's part of a much wider economic shift in society. We see the emergence of these trading sites. They're located on the coast. Examples are Ipswich and London and Hamwick, which is near modern-day Southampton. And they're very much engaged in large-scale bulk product trade with the continent, and there are continental these sites are known as wicks or emporia on the other side as well. Indeed, going up to the west coast of Denmark with the site of Ribe. There's a whole extensive trade network around the North Sea that seems to be engaging with trading products, bringing them up from the inlands of these countries to the coast and then trading them overseas for the first time since the end of the Roman period. This is definitely something more than elite trade in high status goods, which was the much earlier idea before we saw the large scale excavations of these sites in the 1970s and 80s. And the coinage fits into this wider picture. along with the trading sites, there is the start of mass-produced pottery, for instance, in Ipswich ware, which dates to around about the same period. And that distribution network is really extensive. So we find Ipswich ware quite extensively on settlement sites. So there are these sort of more fundamental shifts of gear in the economy that haven't been seen since the end of the Roman period.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. It's a period of transformation. This is it's not as if someone sort of flips a switch one day in 670 and this all happens at once. It's going over a period of, what do you say, Jane, about sort of 75, 80 years after this that you can see all of these things coming together.
From around 600s in the archaeology, we start to see more complex hierarchies in settlements and in buildings. A move towards not just subsistence farming, but producing a surplus that can feed into an economic system where you can trade your surplus and get something in return. I say those changes are happening around 600. We have elite burials, most famously Sutton Hoo, but there are a range of other so-called princely burials where we have clearly elites emerging. So there is that complexity, for a good 70, 75 years or so before we get these wick sites and coinage emerging.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, and it's also, if one goes a little bit later, it's also not as if these vanish when you get to 750 or so. I mean, the coinage does take a bit of a turn for the worse as you move into the middle of the 8th century. It rebounds a bit in the later 8th century, which we can talk about later. But it's interesting to see that the coinage, as it were, helps things go up. But when the coins come down, it's not as if everything else comes down. Yeah,
that these trade sites can continue without coinage is kind of blows my mind. That it doesn't lead to an end to London, or there's no coins. Well, we'll just continue with what? With something else, some other media. So it's not kind of logical to our modern sensibilities, but clearly it was able to happen.
It is. I mean, that's the thing. The wider. I know Luke's about to ask you questions about the methodology, but just on that these are means of exchange. It's just a way of facilitating transactions. So people are kind of just will as we'll talk about maybe bullion economies later, when people can just use, say, metals on the basis of their quality and weight. It's money doesn't have to be coins. And I think sometimes this is something just for some of the listeners who are maybe new to this topic, is it's some in later periods it can be a length of cloth, whatever. It's just currency is not necessarily tied to a gold standard or silver standard. It's something that's just facilitating trade transactions and exchange. But sorry, Luke, you've got a question, I think, about methodology.
So, guys, can you explain to me the methodology for the discovering the silver sources, the actual science behind it?
Yes, of course. We were really interested to find out what the source of the silver was. How is it that you have this really large silver currency in circulation when you hadn't had silver currency for 200 years or so previously? And one way to find that out is through the sort of scientific analysis of the silver itself. There are some established techniques for working out silver provenance. One of those is lead isotope analysis, where we're looking at the variance of the kind of lead that's contained within the silver. And these, although they're silver coins, they do have about 1% of lead in them. That's just plenty for analysing the different isotope ratios. And we're also interested in trace elements. Again, there'll be different amounts of things like copper, zinc, gold, bismuth contained in the coins, and even very slight differences in those elements can tell us something about where the silver comes from. In particular, gold and bismuth are quite important for us because they remain unchanged through the remelting process. So if you have a silver in its original form, it's melted down and made into a coin, the gold level in principle shouldn't change. Of course, silver can be mixed, which will definitely affect both the lead isotope signature and the trace element profile. But the fundamental principles of the analysis is that if you use both of those things in combination, which hasn't been done before for Anglo-Saxon silver, then you can rule out source locations, and you can point to potential candidates as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, the question I gave an absolute hospital pass to Luke there. I meant to ask my question about research questions first. So just to bring it back to sort of wider sense. So what were, because, you know, in academia, we're told the best practice is really, you know, you've got to have a very firm research question. It's not just sort of following your nose. So what did you set out to discover in the study, and, you know, and what did you set out then to sort of talk about in this paper? I mean, I know you're looking at long distance exchange routes and the sort of different periods of economic expansion and contraction, and then ultimately how the silver sources fed into these periods of change. So, you know, when you're setting out this project and this paper, what were the questions that you were really wanting to be answered?
Well, this all started really about, we can pinpoint it quite well, actually. It was in January 2022, because I organised a small conference all about use of coined money in the early Middle Ages, and Jane was a speaker, and there were various other people there. The hope had been that we'd all meet in person and have a lovely time, as one does at a conference, but then the Omicron variant of COVID came along, which meant that we had to do it online, and we could still have all the papers, we still had a good time, but it meant that all the money that would have been spent on accommodation and food and so forth was not spent on that. So there was this chunk of money left from a project I've been doing, and Jane and her colleague, our colleague Stephen Merkel, were already very much engaged in a project looking at this kind of approach for Viking silver. So in discussion at this conference, we said, hey, wouldn't it be interesting to apply this methodology to the periods slightly before the Vikings, to try and get a sense of what the prelude is to all of this, because it's been known for generations that there is a big uptick in the making and use of silver coins in the late 7th, 8th centuries. But really, people had been exercising guesswork as to where that silver might have come from, and there was no good information about what the answer might have been. So we put our heads together and thought of what coins would be useful to look at, what the limitations would be on how many we could get through, how it could all work. What also really helped was the fact that we had the kind support of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, who've got a really fantastic collection, one of the richest single collections anywhere for this period, which meant that even though we only did about 50 coins, we could get a very, very broad coverage of what's going on in England and its neighbours across this period. And what we wanted to find out from this essentially was, could we rule out any possible sources of silver, such as Merkel in Western France, which is really the only major silver mine that's known to have been active in this period? Could we see if Merkel was a major contributor? And if not, where might the silver have been coming from? That was the question that we had, the main question we had coming into this. The second one, I suppose, would be, how can we see any change in where that silver is coming from, either between regions or over the course of this century and a bit?
And yeah, I suppose just going into that then, what were you looking, because your excellent paper is available on Antiquity. Ultimately, you split the period in two in terms of silver sources. So, you know, I think Luke's just going to ask a bit of a background question about the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, but then from that, just sort of leading into how you think the silver from there is getting to northwestern Europe, because I think it's no spoiler now to say that you have now, I think, fairly well proved that the silver in this early period from 660 is coming from the Eastern Roman Empire as well. So I'll just get Luke now to.
Well,
to
I guess, yeah. My question is, what is the Eastern Roman Empire? What do you mean by Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire? Because I don't know.
I think it is a really confusing concept, because it doesn't exist today, and there's no sort of territorial border that you can refer to. And even during the early medieval period, the borders fluctuate hugely, because they have military gains and then territorial losses, and it's always in flux. So we can say that it's centered on modern day Istanbul, which is then Constantinople. It includes in the 7th century areas of Turkey, of Syria, of Bulgaria, but it's not as extensive as it has been in the past. It's contracted. So I think if we take Constantinople as the focal point, but understand that they might have had access to metals and resources outside of the immediate territorial borders, and have a base in the Eastern Mediterranean, then that probably sums up the area of the Byzantine Empire and the sorts of silver sources that they might have had access to.
And it's something that we know. You mentioned Sutton Hoo earlier. And there's an amazing collection of silver sort of gilt in the main plate from that. So I think we're now getting into the sort of more the research paper now. But I think just for the listeners to sort of know what kind of silver sources are available, let's say we'll say in England at that time. So if you just tell us a little about the Sutton Hoo silver and maybe what that's telling us about contacts in the sort of 6th, 7th centuries.
Yeah, well, the Sutton Hoo silver is a really remarkable collection of tableware. So huge platters. I think it's something. I mean, this is radio. Okay, forget that bit.
Oh no, we've got the YouTube version as well. You can do the.
Yeah, I'm off the screen. They're massive. They're massive platters. They're vessels, spoons, so things that you would display on your table in your wooden hall in Anglo-Saxon England. And we know that they're Byzantine first from the style, but also they've got the stamp of the Byzantine emperor, which shows that actually they were 100 years old or so at the time they went into the Sutton Hoo burial, which is dated to 625. So they are sort of fairly, to the people burying the Sutton Hoo person, they're old historic artifacts at that time, and I think archaeologists sort of thought, well, these are kind of spectacular items, but they're a bit of a one-off. I mean, Sutton Hoo has lots of one-off, unique items, but it's not like we have a whole host of other Byzantine silver vessels from other Anglo-Saxon burials in England. That's not the case at all. So when people were debating, well, what could the sources of silver be? Byzantine silver was an option, but it definitely wasn't top of the list of potential options. We weren't really considering that as a highly likely source for the early pennies. In terms of the other silver options, I mean, England does have silver ores in that it has silver-bearing lead ores. They're quite low yields, and it's not clear that even the Romans extracted the silver from the lead ore that they certainly mined. And if the Romans weren't doing it, probably the Anglo-Saxons weren't doing it either. So I think it's unlikely that any silver source came from England or indeed Britain's own sources of metal. So then other options were things like recycled silver from the Western Roman Empire that was sort of gathered together, melted down and made into coinage. It would have to be a lot of it.
This would be like this trapping law treasure when you've got sort of late Roman sort of Western silver. There's obviously some that is circulating there in the medieval period. Is that correct?
Exactly. So you'd have to find it and be prepared to melt it down, and on a scale that could support a really vast coinage. And it was one possibility. And the other option, well, I guess you could have Islamic silver because in the Islamic Caliphate they're producing silver coinage at this time under the Umayyads. That was also an extensive silver coinage. We don't find Umayyad coins in Anglo-Saxon context, so again, it was sort of not a very likely source. But the other possibility was this mine at Mel in Western France, which we know was active at this time because we have radiocarbon dates from the mine. This was an important lead mine that there was silver in the lead, and it was also became a prominent mint place for the Frankish Empire. So they were producing silver there, minting it into coins. And one possibility was that some of this silver was also being sent to England to make the first silver pennies.
And so I think we're getting to the stage now in the podcast where we've got our potential, we've got our suspects, as it were. We're building the case. We've got the suspects. We've got the sort of time, the sort of motive, and opportunity. Potentially, we're linking that into sort of trade. Sort of at that time, sort of money is beginning to move, and they're in need of a means of exchange that's somewhere beneath the sort of gold in terms of what you can buy with an individual sort of penny. So you guys then have got essentially these research questions and these possibilities, your hypothesis, if you will. What then were the practicalities? So you're going to these museums and you're kind of saying to them, can we do, and you'll have to describe it again, a bit about laser ablations. You're going to do some minutely destructive testing, but I suppose still going to a university museum curator and saying, can we do blah, blah, blah? They'll just hear destructive testing. How did that process start then of actually getting the coins and choosing the coins that you could then have a look and see where the silver sources are coming from?
For us, I'd say it probably started with some very friendly and delicate conversations with curators. Because you're absolutely right that anything that's got the word destructive in it is going to raise alarm bells. But we were very fortunate in that the curators at the Fitzwilliam take a very productive, creative approach to this. They were willing to look at how this could be accomplished. And secondly, when we explained to them what we mean by minimally destructive, minimally invasive, they realized that it is really minimal. We're talking about ablating, as in sort of zapping through the outer few microns of these coins across an area that's, Jane will probably know. It's how big is the area, Jane? It's like 1/10 of a millimeter or something.
Yeah, it's about the diameter of a strand of human hair.
Precisely. It's pretty much invisible to the naked eye. So when we put these under the laser and you'd see it on the screen, it looks like the whole thing is lighting up like a Christmas tree. But in actual fact, that's showing you this absolutely tiny magnified area. And so once the coin comes out, you really can't see any sign that it's been through this process at all. And so you'd make a number of spots like this where you'd dig down through the outer layer, and as that material is being pushed back out, it is put into a mass spectrometer, and that is where you get the information about the trace elements from. And then later on, when we did the process of looking at lead isotopes, we also used the ablation process, but then the samples were collected and taken back to the laboratory and assessed using a different process to find out about the balance of lead. So that's how we started discussing this process, how we presented it to the curators, and then what we told them we would do.
I mean, the curators, I think each museum is different and each curatorial department has its own priorities, and sometimes that's not analysing material. But the Fitzwilliam have been brilliant. And this main project that I run with Stephen Merkel, we've analysed other material from the Fitzwilliam, and they've just been super. The curators are very supportive when you have a good research case and considered all the methodological options for sampling. So we're really grateful to them. And just to come back to the second ablation process we did to determine the lead isotopes, this was quite special because it was one of the first times that people had used a portable laser ablation machine, which is a new technique. I think this is one of the first times it's ever been performed on silver. And it's terrific because first it means you can bring the equipment into the museum, so you don't need curators to leave and travel with the coins to normally earth science departments where in situ laser ablations are normally situated.
That's one of the factors, isn't it, Jane, that it's a huge struggle getting these things from A to B, and then you've got to try and do everything in quite a rush, and you got to book time and everything's got to line up, and it's just a huge faff.
Yeah, and it's taking away from the curator's time. So it's much better if we can come to the museum, which we're able to do. And the other benefit, not so much for coins, but for archaeology in general, is that the portable laser doesn't have a chamber, unlike a regular laser ablation machine, which will have a chamber that's about 10 centimeters by 10 by 2 centimeters depth. So you can forget analyzing your massive torque with one of these machines because it's not going to fit in the chamber. But the portable laser doesn't have that. So you're much more free to have awkwardly sized objects analyzed. But the main benefit is that we get much more precise results with this method because, yes, you collect the ablated material via a vacuum in the same way that you would do normally. But instead of that going directly into the mass spec, you then capture it and you dry it out, and you then use wet chemistry to dissolve the silver, and you run it through a multi-collector mass spec to generate lead isotope results. And that gives you the same precision that you would get if you had actually, taken a big slice off of the coin and dissolved the silver that way. So it's normally the case that laser ablation is a bit less precise than that direct physical sampling and wet chemistry. But with the portable laser ablation, we can combine the minimally destructive nature of laser sampling with the very high precision results we get from wet chemistry analysis.
So are we then, we're seeing, because of the paper, which is open access on Antiquity, so people can download it, and there's lots of amazing graphs in it. But I suppose just trying to, and this is a difficult question, to essentially explain one of these graphs in terms of there are areas of signatures. So a particular silver source will have a particular area on a graph, and if your coins match that area of the graph, you say, well, it's more likely to be, say, from one of these Byzantine sources than this source in Western France. Is that correct?
Yes, broadly speaking. Yeah, if you go to this paper, you'll see there's a fair number of graphs to try and show this, which is demonstrating what we think this silver is not, as it were, based on looking at the trace elements and looking at the lead isotopes, but then also what we think it actually is. And yes, that does tend to mean that the results you get from these coins map onto the results we have had from other things, in this case, Byzantine lead and silver objects.
And from that, then I think we can now. I think we've done our homework. I think we can get into the actual results of this now. And I'm going to go back to Sutton Hoo, because we mentioned that it was often sort of gilt silver as well. So there's if you're melting this down, you're going to get some gold in this. And essentially, long story short, are you finding as if someone has melted down one of these massive Sutton Hoo type plates and made coins? Is that what we're seeing? Is this what, this first period, the 660 to sort of 750, is that the picture? You're melting down things like the Sutton Hoo hoard, or the burial hoard as it were, and you're getting coins. Is that correct?
Occasionally, yes. That you do see, I wouldn't say a lot, but we had, I think, one or two among the sample we did, and there are a few others in samples that have been analysed by other people using different methods, where you do see a surprisingly high proportion of gold in these coins. I mean, Jane said we're usually talking about trace elements, so as in 1% or less, let's say, often, a sort of 1,000th or less. But you sometimes see silver coins which contain actually 2 or 3% gold. And that's a lot more than you'd expect just from the traces that will be present in the silver from when it was first mined. That suggests instead that they're coming from an object that contained an appreciably higher portion of gold. And what's interesting is that these few coins that contain more gold, and there may well be more of them out there, they don't all just come from the very first flush of these silver coins. They come from the first few decades of these silver coins. And that's important because it suggests that they've got a stash of this material that they're dipping into and melting down gradually. It's not all happening in one go.
And so it's not all sort of gilt material, but you will be able to tell then from your mass spectrometry that it's more likely to be coming from the kind of silver that you're finding when we still got extant Byzantine silver. Is that correct to say? Yeah, it is. We found that of all the different samples of silver that we put alongside the results from these coins, the only strong match came from Byzantine material from the Eastern Mediterranean. We also looked at lots of other things. We looked at late Roman silver. You mentioned Trappin, or that kind of material. We looked at material from Merkel. We looked at material from lots of other known mines. We looked at, Jane and Stephen, of course, have got all of the material from their 9th century project. So overall, we've got a really quite strong arsenal of comparisons that we can make, and so we're confident that this link with the Byzantine material is a strong one. And so we're in the situation then where the 670s plus, where this is the main silver stock, the source of silver. Does this then gradually get exhausted? What is happening then over this period between the 660s and 750 when you're about to tell us you detected the major change? Is this stock is then just being exhausted, or does something happening around the mid 8th century that the silver changes? Because what your search has shown is that there is a change after 750. So if you can tell us what that changes and maybe your thinking on why the source changes.
Yeah, it definitely seems like the source of silver that they have to make the early pennies, it's a finite supply and it's gradually used down. So we get increasing debasement of that silver as we go into the 8th century. And Rory will have a more precise date on when it kind of peters out and it's no longer a sort of viable currency. But then I think there's a bit of a gap, and then 750 there seems to be a new source of silver coming online, which is completely unrelated to the earlier Byzantine stock, or the few remnants might have been mixed into the very earliest coins produced from 750 onwards. But it's clear that there's a completely new, different, and much more local source of silver, which is the silver coming from Mel.
Yeah, I just add that with the coins from England, you can see that they start to become fewer, they start to become less pure in terms of their silver, and they start to get lighter from around about the 730s, 740 or so. They never peter out completely. In the south of England, which had been probably the richest area in terms of their circulation, they get the closest to nil. They carry on making some in East Anglia, and particularly in the north of England, in Northumbria, you see that actually they are ahead of the game in some ways, that they create a new royally sponsored, royally supervised coinage with the name of the king on it around about 740. So they're already moving that direction earlier. But these new coins, for all that there are somewhat more of them, they too are pretty debased. And they get even more debased as you move into the latter part of the 8th century. So you can see that there is clearly a squeeze. It's just being handled in different ways by different groups.
Okay, so we've mentioned now Mel a few times. I was going to say drill down, but laser blade into Mel. What is happening? Where is a little bit more about the kingdom that it's in, and what is happening there again in this 740s, 50s period that suddenly Mel is where the silver is coming from. The very sort of basic outline as to that change you've alluded to with these regal coins that are coming in as well, but also then the source really starts to change in that mid 8th century. So can you just tell us a little bit about Mel and the impact that it has and why it has that impact and why Mel is the source? I mean, obviously you've said earlier that there's not so much silver going around, but why Mel at that time?
Mel it's very much worth a visit. It's a little bit like the French Jorvik Viking Centre. You can go there and you can visit these Carolingian mines. You can dress up as a Carolingian moneyer and make some coins. It's a good time. So I'd recommend it very highly. It's very strong on the living archaeology front. It is in Western France. It's quite near Poitiers. It's in between Poitiers and Angoulême. So it's sort of on the lower left-hand side of France, basically. And it's an area which is just very rich in lead and silver deposits. And there's been a lot of work done recently by mostly French scholars on how and on what scale and at what point this is being exploited. And the emphasis now shows that the emphasis now has fallen on the period between around about particularly the 9th century, I'd say, is the high point. That there is clearly some exploitation earlier than that, including in the period we're working on, 7th and 8th centuries, and indeed quite a lot of Merovingian silver coins from the western and central parts of France show that they're already using Mel silver on some scale around about 700, 750, that kind of time. But production there ramps up significantly as you move into the later 8th century. And this maps onto when you see Mel silver start to become more widely used for making coins across Francia and then eventually in England as well.
I just want to take, I guess, a step to nowadays, to here and now, and talking about all of this stuff and bringing it to the public. How do you feel about public outreach, podcasts like this, how archaeologists can use them and get their information out in a broader way?
I think they're a very good thing. I think that there should be, I would say should be more, well, there should be more of them, I suppose, but I think that it's really, really
No,
crucial.
let's just keep this one. We don't need more.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely vital to have this dialogue. I think it's first of all, it feeds the interest, which is clearly out there, all sorts of constituencies, both what you might call scholarly but not immediately adjacent. So people who maybe will be working in related fields, related periods, but not directly you're doing, who might find it a really valuable comparison for what they're working on. But also, of course, just interested members of the public, that there is a lot of appetite for information about the early Middle Ages. And I think that it's a really important part of the job for all of those who study it to make sure that we are passing on that information in a way that people can digest and appreciate.
You've done
heard from somebody saying, "Oh, well, I only write for 6 people." Also, so like their whole academic output is designed so that just these 6 people will read it and appreciate it. I mean, not many academics want to be that person these days.
Yeah.
And I'm used to working with in the Viking Age. That's my office, and there's a lot of public interest in the Vikings, which is overall that's a really terrific thing. I'm just so delighted that there was as much public interest in this sort of earlier period, which normally doesn't get as much attention, with the exceptions like the Staffordshire Hoard. But normally the Anglo-Saxons are overlooked in favour of the Vikings. So the idea that people were interested in Byzantine silver plate in England in the 8th century is just brilliant, and it shows that there is public appetite. And I, for one, I think most academics are always delighted to share our research results and to engage with wider society about this.
I think we're in a position now where things like podcasting and social media and stuff gives you an actual direct link to people who may not have had access to research papers and stuff, or may not have, not that they didn't have access, but wouldn't have known where to go to find them. Whereas podcasting, we see people on TikTok all the time, YouTube, that kind of a thing. It's great to see, I think. Well, right.
And I think, I mean, what we, the good thing about this story is it's a great story. It's got great characters in it as well. And, moving back to sort of Mel and the silvers being produced in Carolingia, for want of a better term, you've got Charlemagne, you've got Offa, and actually talking about both them now, I think there's an important role that they have, and you can maybe discuss what's happening in that later period. So this is the later part of the 8th century. So Mel silver is out there, but it kind of gets a turbo boost, and these famous characters that people will have heard of before are kind of the driving forces behind that. So you can sort of say what's happening in the sort of the 790s with Charlemagne and with Offa, and what they're doing with this silver.
Yes, you can see that there is a sort of ramping up of Mel silver on a what you might call sort of more organic basis, which suggests there's basically just more of it being produced and more of it percolating into the making of coin from, as you say, circa 750. It becomes clearer in maybe the 770s, 780s as the material becomes more plentiful. And those two things are probably related, that there's more silver coming out of Mel, more coins being made, more coins survive for us to analyze. But what you do see is that there is, I like the phrase turbocharge, there is a sort of leap to hyperdrive when you get into the early 790s, and there is a reform of the coinage undertaken. In fact, there are 2 reforms of the coinage undertaken at much the same time by Offa in about 792 or 3, and then by Charlemagne in probably just after Offa in 793. And what happens after that is you can see that Mel silver in coins from after that reform, especially in the Frankish kingdom, they become much more dominated by Mel silver. And this includes not just the area around Mel, which had, not surprisingly, shown a higher proportion of Mel silver in the earlier decades. You can see that even in places like Mainz on the Rhine, or Quentivik and Dorstadt, these major trading ports on the Channel coast, they're using a lot more male silver, overwhelmingly male silver by this stage. In fact, what slightly surprised us was that the only area which decreases very slightly in the proportion of male signature silver which is being used is the area around male itself. You actually see that the strength, the dominance of the local silver diminishes very slightly as you move into this period of wider use of it. And we interpret that possibly as meaning that Mel was not only a mine that was being used to produce the metal itself, but it was also perhaps a center for refining coins that had been there already, and that these are being used to kind of dilute slightly the silver that's being mined afresh.
And I'm sort of obsessed with Offa, but Offa and Charlemagne, they kind of write to each other, at least their courts do, don't they? And this is maybe, again, asking you probably the same question, but about why this male silver is getting to England and Frisia and elsewhere, northwestern Europe. I think the letters are about, does Offa want kind of like decent sort of lava querns, and Charlemagne wants, what England is famous for, the sort of cloth and or cloaks. I think it's maybe in that is trade then the mechanism for this silver being able to dominate and spread and get into the other regions that you're in your study area.
Yeah,
I think
there's this wonderful letter from 796 about saying, thank you for the black stones. And yes, so these lava querns are these something a bit more high status like marble. And Charlemagne is saying, well, yes, I got the woolen cloth. Next time, make them a bit longer, please. We want the longer versions. So that there's clearly there's some trade going on between them. And we also know that they're working together to try to prevent merchants posing as pilgrims, so they avoid paying the toll at the market. So that's obviously a common problem on both sides of the North Sea, and that's something they have to work together towards. But the relationship between Offa and Charlemagne, I love that you get this insight into it in the early medieval period, because it's just so understandable. Offa thinks he's Charlemagne's equal. He's nowhere near Charlemagne's equal. There's a period, there's a hiatus in their relationship when Offa suggests that his son can marry Charlemagne's daughter. Does it go that way around? And that's a huge insult to Charlemagne, because no way is Offa on the same level. So relations kind of shut down. Charlemagne stops English boats arriving at his ports for a while. So, trade across the North Sea does sometimes hinge on this sort of personal relationship between these two rulers. So what's fun about the coin analysis that we did is that it shows there's another reason why Charlemagne is so much more powerful than people like Offa, and that's because he's controlling the resources. He must have been sending the silver to England, either in the form of coinage, which is then captured at England's borders and melted down and produce their own coinage, or maybe as ingots, as a kind of raw supply of silver. It's not clear, but England is in receipt of Charlemagne's silver through this period, and indeed continues to be so. So it's a way of revealing the power relations, I think, during this period.
Yeah.
And I think that, coming around to the conclusion of your, wonderful article, Antiquity, is that's what you kind of end on, is saying this is really the story of, the political, and economic control of Charlemagne and ultimately his heirs. Is that correct to say? And then equally, is there a parallel? I was reading through the papers thinking, the Byzantines and the silver, is that silver being gifted for sort of similar ends? There's a diplomatic element to it as well. Just if you could just expand a bit on your conclusions, and maybe just a little bit about what the silver tells us about the sort of politics and the day-to-day life and trade and just life in general.
I think you're quite right, Tom, to allude to this question about how and when the silver is coming in, because we really didn't expect, and I hope Jane agrees with this, I don't think we really expected to find that Byzantine silver was the major source for this surge that you see in the late 7th, early 8th centuries. That took us by surprise. And so it means that our results, for all they're hugely interesting, don't really tell us too much about how the silver got to England, because we didn't look at, say, for instance, these debased gold coins from earlier in the 7th century. Was that being debased using the same kind of silver? It might have been, but we don't know. We also don't know if the same kind of silver was being used to make silver objects as yet, silver ornaments that you find being used in England. This is why we deliberately set it up to some extent as we did in the article, to try and give us or someone the option of going back and asking that question in more detail. I certainly think it's possible there could have been a diplomatic element to bringing over this silver. We know this happened. We know that large amounts of gold and silver were sometimes sent to mollify kings, pay armies, do things like that. We also know there is a lot of trade, particularly of luxuries and semi-luxuries, which would include gold and silver. So it's probably a balance of those two things. The other thing that I think is worth stressing is that we've been emphasizing what's going on in England and to some extent the rest of the sort of North Sea area. But from the word go, it looks like the same general pool of silver, Byzantine silver, was being used in northeast Francia, in England, and in Frisia. So what we can't tell on the basis of the metal is how much interchange there was between these areas, how much silver flowed from Francia to Frisia, Frisia to England, England to anywhere else. That is very hard to pin down. There are differences in how the use of the silver plays out in those areas. So Francia and Frisia, for example, never experience quite the same nosedive that southern England does in the quantity of coinage in the middle of the 8th century. Things they do reduce, but they don't reduce quite as much. So they carry on using them all the way through. So there's a lot more still to be discovered, I think, about this whole story. That we've got these really exciting, really rewarding results, but I think it's opened as many doors as it has closed others.
Mm. Yeah, I think a really big question for future research is by what mechanisms, route, in what form is Byzantine silver reaching Northwest Europe? People always explain the Sutton Hoo silverware as a diplomatic gift. I think that's very likely. But there's increasing research into Sutton Hoo as well that's stressing the other Byzantine links in not just in the silver, but in other artifacts that might point to links towards Syria and other places in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's something that my colleague Helen Gittos at the University of Oxford is examining now. And we might well find in future that there is there is more evidence than we can see for these links to the Byzantine world, and there is a suggestion that maybe Anglo-Saxons are actually traveling there, serving in the Byzantine army. There's a direct connection to the Eastern Mediterranean through people actually traveling and then traveling back to England with these goods. So that can be added to the mix alongside diplomatic goods, possibly some more regular trade, as one of the options for how the silver is actually reaching England.
Because one of the few...
Yeah, sorry, go on.
So I was going to say, one of the few contextual things we can be fairly confident of is that this Byzantine silver is almost certainly not arriving fresh in the 660s, 670s or after, because this is a period when we know there's very little silver coin or plate being made in Byzantium at all. That stops in the early to mid 7th century. But also there's just much less Byzantine material in general found in Britain and the rest of Western Europe at that point. So it's coming in earlier, like the Sutton Hoo material. It's coming in and then sitting there being used or displayed, having something else done with it for a long period before they turn it into coin.
Yeah. Rory, do you think coming in after the Anglo-Saxon conversion to Christianity, is it one of those things that you think that opens up after they convert? So they convert round about, I mean, it's not a single process, it's long and drawn out, but from circa 600 onwards, I struggle to see it coming in before that date somehow.
Yeah, it certainly, I'd say I find that it certainly would make sense, but someone needs to go and do the work, I suppose, find out for sure. Because as you said, the Sutton Hoo, the famous Anastasius plate, I mean, that comes from at least 100 years before the burial, so it's been sitting somewhere for a good long while. It could have been in England, or it could have been in Constantinople, or it could have been in somewhere else. I think the conversion could well have been a factor, which would take us into the early part of the 7th century as a major period for bringing these big piles of silver into the kingdoms.
We see other factions for Byzantine style jewelry and little delicate crosses and things. We see some other influence of the Byzantine cultural world and Christian world in the archaeological record for Anglo-Saxon England. So I wonder, and this isn't something we talked about in the paper, but I've just been thinking about it since, whether that's one of the mechanisms by which the silver reaches England.
That's right. It's also worth saying that there is actually now a fairly strong corpus, fairly big corpus of Byzantine coins found in Britain, but I think almost none of them are silver. There are a fair few gold ones, which tend to come from the eastern part of England. And then there's actually quite a large body of bronze, base metal ones, which come from both eastern and western Britain. It's striking that there is clearly another connection going on. There is clearly a link that's bringing in coins of other kinds, but not silver ones. And that might be a point in favour of looking more at silver plate, silver objects, the kinds of thing from Sutton Hoo as the major force behind this shift in the currency.
And I think that's the best thing about your paper. It just opens up all these areas now that we can, and we've got the hard science behind it. And someone like myself that just piggybacks when I'm looking at trade on all this sort of hard work that's been done. This is a landmark paper for that. And I think there's going to be I know there's going to be a huge amount that come out of this. And just ending from my point of view, what's next? Have you got some more papers coming out of this research, or just anything you'd like to do with this to move on yourselves?
We've got no plans. We don't have anything on the table, though I'm sure we can find more projects and answer some interesting questions. But what I would stress is that this methodology, lead isotopes, trace elements, it works. And I think there's been a lot of skepticism in the past couple of decades that this sort of approach can deliver results. And people have been worried about aspects of mixing silver and refining silver. But I think you can take those into account and you can model for those processes. So what I would stress is that I think this is a really powerful paradigm for analysing silver. And when you can do that, you can address so many questions that you might not have thought were possible to address. So I like the paradigm. I think it's got a lot of future, and with more minimally destructive mechanisms and tools like portable laser ablation that open up, museum collections. I think this is a field for the future.
Yeah, I'd strongly agree with that, and I think it'd be really exciting to apply this most obviously to, say, the 200 odd years before. We were looking at what's happening with silver in the late and immediately post-Roman period, the era of the Hoxne hoard, the Mildenhall treasure, Traprain law, Esquiline hoard, all of those things, but then also moving into the 6th century, the 7th century, things like the silver from the Staffordshire hoard. I mean, obviously there are some results already obtained using various methods that tell you a bit about the metallurgy, but I think that using the approach we've used and comparing it with what we've now got from this later period, it would be fantastic. And you could do the same thing for other periods too. You could look again at what's going on in 10th and 11th centuries, for example. 11th
century would be super interesting, I think. Yeah. Through projects like this, you increase the amount of reference data that you have, so you can, it's a compound effect, so you can characterize your sources more easily. So that's to the good of all future projects.
I love it. It's a good place to end, I think, this conversation on this. Thanks so much for coming on, guys. Before we finish up, I have one question to ask you. This is completely off topic now, and it's just a little bit of fun to end it on a positive note. If you had one question to ask any figure from history, and you only get one question to ask them, who do you pick and what question do you ask? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about this.
I'd be Offa. I want to ask him about his Arabic style gold currency. But that's another podcast in and of itself.
I always say my answer is William Shakespeare and Did You Write Your Plays? That's kind of my
I suppose that's something that the chemistry can't tell you. Just if there was a shortcut to asking a moneyer from Mel saying, "Oh, by the way, why?"
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be about this project either. Just from your own interests.
Crumbs.
Yeah, it's a hot one. And mine would be really boring, actually. I'd ask Guthrum, or one of the 9th century Viking leaders, where do you actually live? Your neighbours. Because we can't find any sort of distinctively Viking sorts of settlements in England. And that's always been one of the big absences that we have. So where are they living? In amongst the Anglo-Saxons, on their own? Where are you guys?
That's a good question.
Yeah. I think I can think of lots of people who'd be interested to go back and talk to, but if you could only get one real question.
That's the tough part.
Yeah, I'd say I'd pick another character who I've been interested in for a long time, who's an author known as Virgil the Grammarian, Virgilius Maro Grammaticus, who is probably Irish or connected in some way with Ireland. But the key thing is nobody knows exactly who he was or where he was. So I'd conjure him into being and ask him, who the hell were you? Where did you live? I'd work all of that into one question.
I think who were you is a great question, because you're not going to get a one simple answer to that. You're going to get a lot of them. That's a
to what extent question, isn't it? But no, that's brilliant. I mean, yeah, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to you for your paper and your co-authors on that as well, which we will plug away at. And just on behalf of Red River Archaeology Group, and Luke will say his own thanks, but from myself, thank you so much, Jane and Rory, for your time. Thank you. So, I think I always start these by saying, we always say, "Oh, well, it was fantastic. It was great." And, I forgot I was recording a podcast at various points, but that was a classic example of that. I think Jane and Rory, they're brilliant at outreach. They're so nice and they're so brilliant, and they're doing all this really incredible hard science outreach as well, which is, it's an art form, isn't it, really?
It is, absolutely. And it was great to talk to them about the outreach of it as well, and how important it is, because they kind of share our values in that, I guess, of that this information belongs to the people, and we need to spread it out there as much as we can, which is what we're doing.
Yeah, it's. I mean that's how we got to be award winning. We share that goal. But I think the thing about this was that you've got this really innovative technique, this laser ablation, this geochemical analysis. And I think the really exciting thing was, over and above, the major revelations that we got about the Byzantine source of the silver, and then Mel in France, and the importance of Charlemagne. It's the fact that there's so much you can do with this analysis, and because it's so minimally destructive, that brilliant museums like the Fitzwilliam Museum, where the coins came from, hopefully more museums are happy to have this analysis done. So it's one of these podcasts you think you're really at the start of I'd say a golden age, maybe a silver age. I think we've got in at the ground floor. So when this research is going on for the next 10, 20 years, we can get Jane and Rory and their colleagues on this paper to hopefully come back on and tell us about any new research they've got. But yeah, absolutely fantastic. Brilliant outreach, brilliant science, brilliant archaeology.
Yeah, no, it was really good. It was really good to hear them talk about it. And if you enjoyed it, why not hit subscribe? Why not hit like? Why not leave us a comment to let us know what you liked about it? Or if there's anybody you'd like to hear or see on the Shindig, hit us up. Let us know. We love to hear from people. So just contact Tom, contact me, leave a comment, like, subscribe, leave us a review, and always listen to the Shindig.
Thank you very much.